Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at the GeForce GTX 1060 3GB version, and we're doing so for a few reasons. The primary reason being that they're available right now for $200 to $250 US, and that's around $100 less than what you can expect to pay for the 6GB model, which of course I also revisited quite recently. The other reason being, I just want to see how a graphics card with 3GB of VRAM is getting on in 2021, so that should be quite interesting. As a quick refresher, the original 6GB version of the GTX 1060 was released back in July of 2016, so 5 years ago now. And then hot on the heels of that release, just 1 month later, Nvidia released the controversial 3GB version. The reason for the controversy was due to Nvidia doing Nvidia things. The 3GB version of the GTX 1060 sounds like it would be the same as the original model that was released a month prior, but with half as much VRAM. And if you made that assumption, you'd actually be wrong, because that's not thinking anti-consumer enough. Rather than just cut the VRAM in half, Nvidia also went with defective silicon supporting 1152 cores, rather than the 1280 cores used by the 6GB version, so a 10% reduction in core count. Now, based on our testing from 5 years ago, we're not limited by VRAM capacity. The 3GB model was around 7% slower on average, but we saw an example with Mirror's Edge Catalyst where it was up to 41% slower due to insufficient memory. So it'll be interesting to see how the two compare today. Given the 3GB model is more than just a change in memory capacity, you'd think that would warrant a more significant alteration to the model name, but apparently not. Pascal was such an epic release from Nvidia that they just had to undo some of that great work with anti-consumer practices. Oh, and don't forget the DDR4 version of the GT 1030. Anyway, all that drama's in the past now, and what we have here in the present is this second-hand 3GB version of the GTX 1060. And if you're thinking of getting your hands on one as a make-do type solution until RTX 3070s don't cost more than your first car, you probably want to know how it performs in today's games, so let's go find out. For comparison, we have the 6GB version, and we'll be comparing the two in 15 games at 1080p and 1440p using a range of quality settings. All testing has been conducted on our Ryzen 9 5950X test system using 32GB of DDR4 3200CL14 memory and the latest available display drivers. So these results are going to be entirely GPU limited. Okay, let's get into it. Starting with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we see that the 3GB model is 6% slower at 1080p using the low quality settings. So about what you'd expect to see when not exceeding the VRAM buffer. However, by using the medium quality preset, we start to run into trouble as here the margin swells to 20%, dropping the average frame rate from 59 FPS down to 47 FPS. But things get even worse with the high quality preset, as here the 3GB model drops off by a 54% margin, going from a playable 48 FPS to a stuttery mess with just 22 FPS. This means at the very least you want to keep the texture quality at its lowest possible value when tuning other quality settings, and you'll have to do so at 1080p because at 1440p there's really no way to make the 3GB model work. We're looking at a 37% performance reduction using the low quality settings at 1440p, so therefore medium and high are obviously out of the question. So in terms of value, the 6GB model is worth paying around 50% more for if you predominantly play games such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla, as it nets you around 50% more performance, but more crucially, will enable playable performance. The Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege results are also very interesting, though here the 3GB buffer is, for the most part, sufficient. For example, at 1080p using low, we see a 7% drop in performance and then just a 5% drop with medium. However, we are looking at a far more significant 24% drop off using the high quality settings, though the game was still playable. But given the reduction in performance for the 3GB model when using the high quality preset at 1080p, you might expect the 1440p data to be a complete disaster. But it's not. Using the same quality settings, the 3GB model was just 9% slower, dropping down from 89 FPS to 81 FPS. Now, I believe this is because the memory capacity is no longer the greatest performance limiting aspect of the card, and isn't severe enough here where it completely tanks performance. So the 3GB model does make out reasonably well here, and was certainly able to deliver playable performance. Surprisingly, Biomutant doesn't run into any issues with the 3GB 1060 using the low, medium, and even high quality presets, though be aware we're not testing with the maximum quality preset. That being the case, the 3GB model is 7 to 10% slower than the 6GB version, and that's typically what you'd expect to see when not limited by memory capacity. The margins are a bit all over the place in Outriders. At 1080p using the low quality preset, the 3GB model is just 5% slower, so that's just about a best case scenario. However, turning the quality settings up just a single notch saw the margin open up to 24% as the 3GB model dropped down to just 51 FPS, whereas the 6GB card was good for 67 FPS. The margin does remain much the same using the high quality preset. Here the 3GB card was 21% slower. Quite interestingly though, as we move to 1440p, the 3GB model is still 5% slower using low, and then 22% slower with medium, but then just 12% slower with high. But as we saw in Rainbow Six Siege, it is possible to get to the point where running out of VRAM isn't the primary cause for limiting performance, rather it's just GPU performance, and we see this here using the high quality preset. You would expect the 22% margin seen with the medium preset to be mirrored or extended with high, but instead it's reduced to 12%, and that's because the shader performance of the GPU is the primary performance limitation. Here we're seeing more evidence of this behavior with Horizon Zero Dawn. Again, you'd expect the limited VRAM buffer of the 3GB model to have the least amount of impact using the lowest quality preset, so in this case the favor performance preset. But here we're looking at a 21% drop in performance for the 3GB model, and at least half of that figure can be attributed to the VRAM buffer. Interestingly though, using the higher quality original preset, the margin is reduced to 17%, and then with the favor quality, which is the second highest quality preset in the game, the margin is reduced yet again to just 12%, which isn't far off what you'd expect to see when using 3GB or less VRAM. The truth is the VRAM buffer of the 3GB model was exceeded under all three test conditions. It just so happens to be that it was the primary performance limitation when using the lowest quality preset. Preset scaling behavior is more what you'd expect to see in Shadow of the Tomb Raider when running out of VRAM. At 1080p, the 3GB model was just 5% slower using the lowest and low quality presets, but using medium kills the 3GB 1060, as here performance drops off to the tune of 39%, slashing frame rates from 61 FPS with the 6GB model to just 37 FPS. Had VRAM capacity not been an issue here like what we see with the low and lowest settings, the 3GB model would have delivered around 58 frames per second. Then at 1440p we find the 3GB model is 8% slower using the lowest preset, 13% slower with low, and then 29% slower using medium. Now, Doom Eternal doesn't allow you to exceed the VRAM buffer, so it's not possible to test certain quality settings. Worse still for the 3GB model is the fact that even with the low quality preset, the buffer's already maxed out, and as a result it trailed the 6GB version by a 25% margin at 1080p and 24% at 1440p. The game was still playable at both resolutions, so there is that, but you're limited to the low quality settings with this model, or at the very least the lowest quality textures. The 3GB 1060 was consistently around 14% slower than the 6GB model in Death Stranding at 1080p, which is a larger margin than you'd typically expect to see, so perhaps there's some memory limitations creeping into these results, and that certainly appears to be the case at 1440p. Here the 3GB model was between 16 to 20% slower, and that is due to the limited VRAM buffer, as it should only be up to 10% slower. This really is an issue for those wanting to play Death Stranding at 1440p, as it meant dropping down from almost 60 FPS using the medium settings with the 6GB model to just shy of 50 FPS with the 3GB version, and you will certainly notice that difference. Moving on to Dirt 5, and here the GTX 1060 3GB was 12% slower at 1080p using the ultra low quality settings, then 11% slower with the low and medium settings. So pretty similar scaling across those three presets at 1080p. Then at 1440p we see a 5% reduction in performance for the 3GB model using the ultra low and low presets, and then a 10% drop with medium. So for the most part the 3GB model works fine on Dirt 5 using the lower quality settings. For testing Watch Dogs Legion with these older products, I've ignored the very high and ultra quality presets, as these GPUs simply aren't powerful enough to handle those quality settings. That being the case, the 3GB 1060 does reasonably well here, with performance typically between 7 to 13% slower than the 6GB model. Now, these results are a bit of an eye-opener. Playing Resident Evil Village with a 3GB 1060 is extremely difficult, and short of using the lowest possible quality preset at 1080p, you really can't, and it's certainly not possible to achieve a 60 FPS experience. So this is an example of a game that does make products like the 3GB 1060 obsolete. And another game that makes the 3GB 1060 obsolete is Cyberpunk 2077. Here it's not even possible to achieve 40 FPS using the absolute lowest quality settings at 1080p. The 6GB model isn't exactly amazing either, but with over 20% greater performance, it's at least playable. Frame rates in Forza Horizon 4 for the 3GB model are quite good, and using the lowest quality preset at 1080p allowed for 159 FPS, so that's just 5% fewer than the 6GB version. We see similar scaling with the medium quality settings, and then a large drop off using Ultra, where the 3GB card was almost 30% slower, and similar scaling was also witnessed at 1440p. Surprisingly, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order plays perfectly fine on the 3GB 1060, even when using the highest quality settings, though you'll want to stick to 1080p as there's simply not enough GPU power here for 1440p gaming, at least with the epic quality preset enabled. At 1080p, the 3GB version was typically 5 to 7% slower, and then up to 12% slower at 1440p, but overall, decent performance in this title. Then last up we have F1 2020, and no real surprises here, the 3GB 1060 plays just fine, trailing the 6GB model by a 6 to 8% margin. As a result, the 1080p performance was highly playable, even with the maximum quality preset, and really you could get away with running this card at 1440p. Before we wrap the testing up, here's a look at the 17 game average, and as you can see, the 3GB version of the 1060 does fare much worse than it did just a few years ago, and it's no longer just 7% slower on average at 1080p. In fact, using the lowest quality settings, it was on average 14% slower, and then 20% slower using the medium settings, and a whopping 32% slower with the high quality settings. Then as you'd expect, it is a similar but slightly worse story at 1440p, as here the 3GB model trailed by a 20% margin using low, 22% slower with medium, and then 23% slower using high. Again, the margins using the high preset at 1440p are actually better for the 3GB card when compared to what we saw at 1080p, and this is down to the fact that the 1060 becomes more limited by its own raw performance. Having gone a few years now since I last looked at the 3GB GTX 1060, I was very interested to see how it would tackle the latest and greatest games. And although I knew it wasn't going to be terribly pretty when using the higher quality settings, I had expected it to fail less than it did with the lowest quality settings. Games such as Resident Evil Village and Cyberpunk 2077 were complete write-offs, but we also saw large performance drop-offs in games such as Doom Eternal, Death Stranding, and Horizon Zero Dawn. Still, there was a number of games where the 3GB buffer didn't cause any issues, and as I suspected, highly popular esports titles such as Rainbow Six Siege ran just fine. So if you are a competitive gamer using an older and slower graphics card, maybe something like a GTX 750 Ti or possibly even slower, then there's certainly some value in upgrading to the 3GB 1060, as it will net you quite a bit of extra performance, and it's made all the more attractive by the fact that it is one of the cheapest graphics cards available on the second-hand market right now. Ultimately though, my advice would be to just hold out, wait for the industry to improve, and buy a more modern graphics card at a reasonable price, though of course I have no idea how long it'll take before we're back to a normal type situation. So if you're desperate to get gaming and don't want to break the bank, this is one of the better options available right now, especially for esports type games. On a side note, I expect this video will generate a bit of chatter regarding the newer GeForce GPUs, such as the RTX 3070, which only comes with 8GB of VRAM, whereas competing parts like the RX 6800 packs twice as much at 16GB. In the case of the 3GB versus 6GB battle, it took at least 3 years before the lower capacity model started to regularly run into issues, and then about 5 years before it was completely unusable in some games. Now you could argue that 3GB of VRAM wasn't considered a lot back in 2016, and perhaps 4GB versus 8GB would be a more valid comparison, but I think at the end of the day, the results would be much the same. I also think that we can agree that in 2016, 4GB of VRAM was considered mid-range at best, and probably more suitable for lower-end products. Meanwhile, 8GB was high-end, with premium products of the time, at least on Nvidia's side, receiving 11 and 12GB buffers. Fast forward to today though, we're now 5 years into the future from when Pascal launched. Is 8GB of VRAM still suitably high-end or mid-range even? Personally, I think not, and I'd say AMD is on the right page when it comes to memory buffers. 16GB or more at the high end, 8 to 16GB at the mid-range, and then 8GB at the low end, maybe even 6GB, but I do believe we're past the point where 4GB buffers are useful. All of that said, the RTX 3070 works fine for the moment, but you have to wonder how an 8GB buffer will get on in a few years' time. Of course, you can always turn down stuff like textures to reduce VRAM load, and I think that's a perfectly acceptable compromise to make on a low-end product and even some mid-range products, but probably not for $500 plus graphics cards. Of course, the RTX 3070 versus RX 6800 battle is quite complicated and can't simply be decided by measuring VRAM buffers. The GeForce graphics card has a number of strengths, such as the more mature ray tracing support, a growing list of DLSS supported titles, and the Nvidia encoder. But if it becomes heavily VRAM constrained in a few years' time, all of those advantages do go out the window and the 3070 becomes a gimped product. It's not even a question of if, but rather when. And unfortunately, I don't have an exact answer for you on that one. But as I've said in content specifically comparing these parts, if you wish to hold onto your graphics card for 3 to 5 years, I expect that the RX 6800 will end up being a much better investment for you. But if you upgrade every 2 to 3 years, the RTX 3070 might offer more value in the short term, thanks to features such as DLSS, providing it's supported in the games you play. Again, you can start to turn down visual quality settings such as textures to avoid big performance hits or stuttering, but is that an acceptable compromise on a $500 plus graphics card? Personally, I think not, but really that's for you to decide. And again, we don't know when this will actually be a problem for a product like an RTX 3070 or just any 8GB graphics card. Anyway, before I go too far down that rabbit hole, I think I'll end the video here. If you enjoyed this revisit of the 3GB GTX 1060, then please do hit the like button. You can subscribe for more content. Also, we do have the new Hardware Unavailable merch in the store right now. The link for that will be in the video description. We also have Hammer Unboxed and Hardware Unboxed as well. So yeah, if you want to check the merch out, then links there. Don't mess around. We have had a lot of orders so far. Again, I'm not sure how long we will continue this latest run of merch. So if you do want t-shirts, hoodies or whatever, then yeah, check that out. Otherwise, we have Floatplane and Patreon. You can subscribe there as well. You get access to our exclusive Discord server. What else do we do? Monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, Q&As. So quite a few cool things there. So again, if you're interested, check it out. Links in the video description. But if not, that is perfectly fine. I would like to just thank you for watching this video. That's always very much appreciated. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.